You're listening to the Generation to Generation podcast, episode 8. Joining me on the podcast today are authors Jeff and Beth McCord. Beth is the founder of Your Enneagram Coach, a community designed to be a safe place for individuals to explore the Enneagram. Jeff served as a pastor and helped lead several churches for more than 20 years, and both share a deep passion for the Enneagram and how it's helped transform both of their lives, their family, and doing ministry. Our conversation today takes a deeper look at the Enneagram as a tool, and we cover a wide range of topics, including how emotionally healthy leadership in the church means a growing awareness of who God has made us to be, as well as the importance of discovering our beauty and brokenness with a deeper understanding of how we see the world. Jeff and Beth offer great advice on ministry that I think will be a source of encouragement. I hope you enjoy. Thanks for listening. Welcome back to the Generation to Generation podcast. I'm Michael Coggin, and today we have authors and speakers Jeff and Beth McCord. Jeff and Beth are experts on the Enneagram, and if you're not familiar with the Enneagram as a tool, you can go to their website, which is yourenneagramcoach.com. They also recently had a book come out, Becoming Us, Using the Enneagram to Create a Thriving Gospel-Centered Marriage. Really excited to have you both on the show today.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Michael.
Yeah. Well, I think a good place for us to start is if you could share with our listeners where the two of you are at in ministry and in so many ways being experts when it comes to the Enneagram, what you have going on currently related to the Enneagram.
Yeah, so we, for the past 20 years, we've been working within the local church. It wasn't until just this last June that I had stepped down from being an executive pastor, and Beth was along my side. But in 2014, some opportunities came about. While we were in seminary in 2000, we learned about the Enneagram from some dear friends, and it really stuck with Beth. But it for fear of what it would mean if we told people we were interested in this tool and, you know, with all the blood sacrifices that go along with it. We didn't want to tell anyone about it. But in 2014, Beth had a burning passion. I mean, to be honest, I think she was called out by God to start Your Enneagram Coach. Bethy, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so as we'll get into the Enneagram and all that stuff, and I'm sure a lot of people that are listening to are at least somewhat familiar with it, but as a type 9, I, again, devoured it in 2001 and continued to learn at probably a very fast pace just because I just loved it. But as a good old 9, I kind of hid for umpteenth years, let's say 15, behind the scenes, keeping it quiet. Well, and like Jeff said, because back in the day, nobody knew about it. Yeah. And there was really no gospel-centered approach to the Enneagram. So to use it in the ways that it was being promoted or in books would have been really weird and suspicious. And so what Jeff and I had done throughout those 15 years up to starting Your Enneagram Coach, I would read stuff and go, gosh, there's a lot of really good truth here, but I sure don't like the way they've worded it or how they're conceptualizing it. So I'd talk to Jeff about it. And with his years of seminary, he'd go, oh, well, we would say it this way, or we would see it this way. And I'm like, oh yeah, that makes so much more sense. So we did that over the course of 15 years. And so when God really woke me up as a 9, and that's a whole thing for 9s, and gave me the passion to start Your Enneagram Coach, we had already done all this work. And so it was really just putting it then into on paper, basically, so to speak. And so that's really what we've been doing for the last 3 years since we've started Your Enneagram Coach. And like this year's just been a really big year in developing a lot of content to get it out there, but it's all from a gospel-centered approach.
And I've just been so thankful because I've just used a lot of that content just with clients and other people just at our church and other churches as well. Jeff, were you going to, cut in?
Well, to our surprise and amazement, this our platform, we're close to reaching over 1 million people every month, and we're in at least 20 different countries at this point. And so we're learning to surf a wave. but while trying to maintain both the integrity of the gospel and its focus upon the person and work of Jesus.
Yep.
In addition, hold the Enneagram with some degree of respect and dignity, because it is such a helpful tool, but it really isn't the fundamental answer that we're all longing for. But man, it's so helpful to get us in that direction.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things I appreciate in your book Becoming Us is how you share about Travis and Susan Stewart, those friends who introduced you to the Enneagram, because they, I think, left that lunch and a few days later had lunch with my wife and I, sharing and shared the Enneagram as well. So that was our first exposure to it as well. But for us, for Sherry and I, it really was years later that we actually really started to kind of sit down and look at how I was a 2 and what that meant, and for her as a 9, as you said, kind of coming alive and in one sense, and being able to kind of speak to kind of what was going on in her hearts. But as we pressed into it, I think one of the things that so stood out is I kind of wondered if my smart TV had been monitoring our conversations for the previous 14 years of our marriage, and just in so many ways brought into focus, outside of just gender differences or family of origin dynamics, just how Sherry and I see the world in different ways, but how to navigate those differences. Was wondering if you could speak more about what the Enneagram is and why it's so useful as a tool.
Sure. Yeah. So the Enneagram is, it's basically a map of your internal world. And it lets you know why you think, feel, and behave in particular ways. So that's much different than Myers-Briggs and DISC and Strengths Finders. Those are telling you kind of what you do on the outside. This is getting to the heart of why you do what you do, which is so important for us as believers. And the reason why we use it this way, so we talk about the Enneagram being an internal GPS. So you have your current location, which is your main Enneagram type. And then you have your healthiest destination, right, where you're heading, which is being more like Christ in the way he designed you. But often we find ourselves falling asleep at the wheel or being distracted, texting, who knows what, and you veer off course into a common pitfall on the side of the road. Well, the Enneagram not only is like the internal GPS, it's kind of letting you know what's going on and where to go and where not to go, but it's like a rumble strip on the highway. It's going to alert you, to wake you up and say, hey, if you keep thinking, feeling, and acting out this particular path, you're going to land into that common pitfall again, which was so helpful because I think it was about year 10 that Jeff and I were married, and we'd known the Enneagram a little bit. As a pastor's wife, I really, because I was stuck once again, same old things. And I just kind of threw up my hands and I thought, is there any sanctification happening in my life? I am really wanting to honor God. I'm really wanting to love my family well, but I keep doing the same things. And when you see those patterns over and over again and you have those thoughts, all you're doing is heaping on self-condemnation and shame. But I also knew Romans 8:1, that there is no more condemnation. But why was this happening? And how do I reconcile this? And that's when the Holy Spirit alerted me about not only the kind of the rumble strip idea, but also the levels of health, which we call the levels of alignment with the gospel. So the Enneagram is going to let you know when you are aligned, misaligned, or out of alignment with the truth of the gospel. And this doesn't mean your relationship status with God is changed in Christ. That always remains the same. It's where's our heart and our mind at the moment. And that's kind of like the rumble strip. So it lets us know, oh, okay, so for my personality style, when I start as a type 9, when I start going along to get along, I'm starting to get in the weeds. Now, sometimes I don't even, without the Enneagram, I would not have known that that was a harmful thing for me. That just seemed what you do, right? What doesn't everybody do this? Because we all think people see the world through the same perspective, but there are 9 perspectives, which are the 9 basic personality types. So I go along to get along, but then when Jeff doesn't go along to get along, I think he's being mean, right?
Yeah.
And now it's like, oh, well, not only are you not being mean, you're coming from a different personality perspective, but I need to own that I shouldn't go along to just get along. Now, there's obviously some times where that's good and gracious and kind, but I need to know when I am starting to derail and go into that common pitfall in areas that are not helpful for me. So we want to use the Enneagram to illuminate our heart condition. And that's why this is so powerful for the Christian, because the Enneagram is like an X-ray. It's going to let you know when something's broken, but it can't heal you. But it's super helpful in knowing that there's something wrong. But then we always have to go back to the truth of the gospel, surrender and depend on Christ to work in and through us to get us back on our healthiest trajectory, which is being more like him. And that is why this is so powerful in our Christian life, is it accelerates transformation in the sense that it highlights what's going on, whether good, like, hey, you're growing. These are the ways you're going to grow. That's exciting. Oh my gosh, look, I'm feeling this freedom and this is why. I can see it in my personality style. Or, man, I'm really struggling. Oh, here's the reasons why. And getting the right help in those moments is crucial. So we don't want to use it when we see ourselves veering off course. We don't want to use it to heap on shame, self-condemnation, and fear. That's been taken care of by the work of Christ. This is the opportunity for us to actually feel his embrace and move towards him, asking him once again to help get us in alignment with him.
I really appreciate just your mentioning of shame, just because in so many ways, just how the enemy uses shame to lock us up from moving towards our spouse or feeling the freedom to move towards the Lord and experience his love and his presence. And just throughout your work, just your emphasis on the Enneagram as a tool, and that ultimate transformation happens through our relationship with Jesus Christ and just the gospel of grace. Just kind of wondering, for you, Jeff, how would you say just that GPS, those rumble strips, as kind of Beth was talking about, helped, free you up from that shame to be able to move towards Beth in marriage?
And man, I've done a lot of conversations about this in order to come to this reality. But so I was adopted as a child by Johnny and Gerald McCord. They looked very different from me, but they had their own stories as well. And so I was adopted because my mom was ill. She couldn't have children, and that illness continued through the majority of her life. And what that meant for me is that as she would go into the hospital 2 or 3 times a year, I grew up becoming my own parent. Mm-hmm. And the lens through which I saw that was, you're on your own. And so relationships became this dependent relationship. Like, I would find security when I found help, but I would always fear that I would lose that help. So the way that translated into my marriage is that I was bringing this need for attunement to Beth that really was damaged by my family of origin. And so whenever she as a 9 would kind of check out or want to back out of the conversation, I would intuitively and physically interpret it as abandonment. And I would flip. It would just, things would happen that I would just get really big. And really it was like I feel young when that happens. Now, thankfully that's happened less over the years as I'm more attuned to it. But what's interesting, Michael, is that it also shows up in ministry in the church. Yeah. Because I always had this ambivalent relationship with the lead pastor. I wanted him to provide me security that I longed for as a 6, but they were fallen people as well. And so I would often have this love-hate relationship with them, and I would confuse them. I would be strong at times. I would be very tender and gentle at times. I'd be very supportive, and then at times I'd be very challenging. And they would look like, I don't know where you're at, Jeff. And really it's because of what was going on in my own interior world that's described as a 6.
But also, if I could just add, what's really interesting about this is a lot of people will say, oh, well, you had that experience, Jeff, because you're a 6. Like, your mom was sick and therefore you grew up with that lens which caused you to be a 6. And in actuality, what we find is, because of these 9's lenses, God created us a certain way to be unique and to have a bent, right? And so we would say every baby that's born actually has sunglasses on that you can't see. Yeah. They have a certain shade, and that shade is their personality type, their bent. And we believe that they see the world through that perspective. So if Jeff had been a type 7, he actually would have reacted to the same scenario very differently because he would have felt that his needs aren't taken care of, which is a huge deal for sevens. Like they want to do this, that, and the other, and then some more to fill up this emptiness inside. Well, his mom wouldn't have been able to do that. So you would have probably seen a very hyperactive kid going from thing to thing, or at least fearing that he can't. And so it just would have been a very different dynamic with the same circumstance. So what's interesting is we want to use our story to help us to understand our heart. But the circumstance isn't what caused it. The circumstance reveals the type.
It's interesting that you mentioned the dynamics of the seven. I was just having a conversation with a leader who describes himself as a seven, and he repeated word for word what you just said, Beth. He was talking about how he felt the need, even as an adult, to move every 3 years. And it wasn't until he pressed into his story and the motivations of his heart that, he was able to be more at rest in community. And also, as both of you shared, also reminds me of a friend, Scotty Smith, who did our premarital counseling, who used to say to my wife and I, if both of you were the same, one of you would not be needed. That's always kind of stuck with me, because it was a reminder at those early stages of my relationship with Sherry for the need for appreciating differences and growing in empathy. Which kind of really leads in, Beth, I appreciated your conversation with Adam Young on his podcast, The Place We Find Ourselves, earlier this year, on the relationship with the Enneagram and trauma, and would really encourage those listening to look those episodes up. Several things stood out to me in that conversation that come out in your book is how the Enneagram can help us to speak to people in their language and dialect, and the Enneagram impacting the empathy we have for others. How would you say you've seen that, the Enneagram help leaders grow in empathy?
Yeah, that's great. Jeff, do you want to take that one? Since, you're more in the leadership of the church. I can just kind of handle it as a broad. I'll start with the kind of broad, and then you can go into the church. But I would say that is so important. Empathy is so important. Compassion. And what I remember is learning about the word compassion when it talks about Jesus, that it wasn't just, oh, I feel for that person. It was like a gut wrenchingness in the stomach that he felt. Like it was really deep and intense. And I think a lot of us don't feel that because people have a hard time understanding one another. And so that's what the Enneagram is so great, because when you understand that there are 9 lenses, you realize, okay, first and foremost, there are different ways, valid ways of seeing the same circumstance. It's like all of us right here, we're looking at one another through Skype, but we're seeing things from a very different perspective. And that's valid. And so when we're in a circumstance with other people, it's really important that we realize that people see it from a different vantage point, very different. And the reason that we talk about this is the very first chapter in our book. The title is called Assumicide. And assumicide is when we assume incorrectly other people's thoughts, feelings, and motives, because we think everyone sees the world the way we do. And then we align our thoughts and feelings and behaviors according to that assumption. And therefore we get upset and angry and try to control and demand of people. But what if we realize before everything that people are seeing and interpreting the world differently? How could I ask clarifying questions to understand them better and their viewpoint, and then have empathy and seeing where they struggle? Because here's the thing. All of us are trying to show that we don't struggle in the world. We got it all together to some degree. And when you read the Enneagram and you read the struggles of each of the type, it helps understand why we're struggling in that way. And so that's going to be really important for us to realize, okay, everyone that I'm talking to, even if they look like they're polished and they've got it all together, they have core struggles as well. Mm-hmm. And I have core struggles. And that allows us to come alongside one another and then ask the other person, in a sense, can you tell me, or can you share with me the lens that you see the world through? And that's where it gets really powerful. So then you take the lens and you put it, and you see it through their perspective, and man, your heart starts to kind of think a little bit like, wow, yeah, I didn't realize how much you struggled.
I think that's just such a good reminder of the reality that, everyone we're in relationship with has a core struggle, and just our need as followers of Christ to grow in empathy to those that we're in relationship with, remembering that they bear God's image, and really to have a position of our hearts of asking questions, which I would say really is such a lost art in our culture, but asking questions of what's going on in our own hearts, but asking questions of, where is this other person at, and, what is that deep core fear, that deep core struggle. So just kind of wanting to kind of press in a little bit more, what would you say are some of the questions you've learned to ask because of the Enneagram?
So the question that Beth and I have learned to ask with one another is, one, to ask people to rephrase or reframe their question.
Yeah.
That's number one. So if I'm experiencing something emotionally or physiologically when someone makes a comment, then I don't have to react to it. I can simply ask the question, hey, could you reframe that? But then secondly, what we've learned to do is like, that landed on me odd. It felt like you're coming on a little strong.
Yeah.
So would you mind rephrasing for me? Because I think I missed it.
Yeah.
And that opportunity often gives us a chance to reframe things and even to catch ourselves. So I may say something with more energy and passion that's coming from my own core motivations. And when Beth reflects back, I'm able to understand, oh, there's something happening inside of me. And what I find in staff meetings and leadership meetings is we're much more reactive, assuming that we understand one another.
Yeah.
And we don't. We're inserting tons of motives. We're about why they would have said it and what their goals are. And to be honest with you, we're really in Satan's playground there, because rarely is it actually true.
Yeah.
But we're operating as if it is.
It's interesting that you say that, guys, because, one of the things as I read your book was that, not only for our spouse, just the importance of us to slow down and really seek to kind of hear and understand, what they're saying, and not go into a place of defensiveness or reactivity. But just as we're talking about this, really trying to understand and think through, how much of church conflict really is actually connected to what you're talking about right now.
Oh my gosh. I would say so much.
Yeah.
So much.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Sure.
I think if we will just first assume that we're all seeing it differently.
Yeah.
And so we talk about it in the book, asking clarifying questions, because, hey, that landed on me this way from my perspective, but maybe you meant it differently. Could you help me understand it better or more clearly from your perspective? Now, hey, maybe the person did mean it that way.
Yeah.
And that's a whole nother issue. But most of the time we'll realize, oh, you actually meant it differently. And now we've just, kind of gone through a detour around a conflict that didn't need to happen. And so that's so important for churches and for people in the church to learn to love one another well, to come to one another in the way God created them, to esteem his creation and how he created them, but also to love them when they're falling, when they're struggling, and to not make it all about us and the way we see the world, but to come alongside one another and support one another in this journey of life, which is really hard.
Yeah. You mentioned Jack Miller in your book, and it's just interesting as we've done this podcast, just how many people have been impacted by his ministry and his life and his work. So many pastors, counselors, leaders in the church. One of the things I really appreciated that Jack used to say is that ministry can be a tempting mistress. And, when I think about that, just the reality that in vocational ministry, whether you're a pastor, counselor, serving in the church, outside the church, just how easy it is to align our hearts, our hopes, our longings, just to other people, and just to ride that kind of performance roller coaster. And so just kind of wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, just the danger of that in ministry, but also just the benefit and the helpfulness of the Enneagram as a tool to kind of navigate some of those realities.
Yeah, I know this to be true for my own story. And it may take some time to consider. And, I went through a lot of counseling to get to this point. But being a type 6 and growing up in my family, I became a fixer. Matter of fact, whenever I was doing some training Dan Allender after seminary, we ended up doing strength finders. Mm-hmm. And my top strength is called restorative. I find problems and fix them. Well, if I were to look back at my childhood, I found problems and fixed them. And so guess what role I took on in the local church? The executive pastor role.
Yeah.
Where I would find problems and fix them. What we're sometimes unaware of is that we are trying to meet core needs and desires through our roles in the local church, in ministry. And it frustrates us and moves us to depression and despondency when we find that the church and the people in church cannot resolve what our needs are in our hearts. They're never intended to come through for us in that way. And so what the Enneagram can help you to understand is how you are what you are pursuing on the desire side, what you are fearing, what you're running away from, and why you have such discontent in your heart when God's people don't come through for you, because they were never made to do that. But the Enneagram can help you to understand yourself and allow that to, like David's prayer, search me and know me, mm-hmm. meaning his lack of awareness led him to prayer to ask God to help him to do that. But it can also lead you to compassion, to give God's people a break, for them to be who they are, and for you to give yourself grace to be who you are.
It's such a good reminder of just really asking the question of, where is my heart right now? What am I basing my identity in? And, I just appreciate that, Jeff. And for you, Beth, just kind of wondering, what has it looked like for you in light of the Enneagram, working through some of the challenges of ministry and just some of those difficult seasons that we can all walk through in the midst of ministry and serving in the church.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not only for my own self, but also when we've helped, whether it's people in ministry or just in the church. I think the biggest thing, and we talked about this at the beginning, is when you understand your type on a deeper level, and it doesn't have to be the most complex level of the Enneagram because it gets pretty deep, but just on a really good, I really get myself. So you're setting up those rumble strips on the highway. By learning what's going on, the hardwiring in your mind, what it's like when you're in autopilot and then when you're not doing well, that's mm-hmm. so crucial. And that being your rumble strip. So for instance, as a type 9, the messages that are in my mind are something like, Beth, your presence doesn't matter. You're not important. Just kind of slip to the background. Don't assert yourself. That is a very typical 9 mindset when I'm not at my best.
Yeah.
But it feels absolutely real. I mean, like as much as, my coffee mug here is.
Yeah.
And I can be very convinced that is truth. But now that I understand that is more of a misaligned and out of alignment thinking, that God has called me special and my presence matters to him. He came for me. He died for me. He rose again for me to bring me in relationship with him. I don't know how you can show anyone that their presence matters more than that. Mm-hmm. So the truth is my presence does matter, not in a narcissistic way, but in a God ordained, a God created way. Then when that thought pops up in my mind, and it can happen in an instant. It's not even something that I just sit and think about. It just pops in. So if I'm in a staff meeting, at a church, yeah. I could easily have that pop in my mind and I'm convinced it's real. And then I will react in that way, usually by becoming more quiet and distant instead of showing up and giving my full presence and what I have to offer. But now I can use it as a rumble strip. So every time that thought comes into my mind, it still feels real. I can go, wait a second. That's not truth, though. Now, there's a battle. It's like a temper tantrum inside that myself is like, no, but it is real. Here's the reasons. And then God's truth and the Holy Spirit are like, no, but here's really what's real. And I have to kind of surrender and depend on what is true. And it's hard because, man, what feels true is that my presence doesn't matter. But I have to step in faith and walk with the Holy Spirit in what is truth. And that's super difficult. But if each of us could understand what are the lies that we are believing and what is the truth that God has given us, and to walk in faith and trust Him, we will see so many beautiful things come forth. Now, it is super hard. Like I said, it's like a tantrum is happening inside. And if people are familiar with IFS, internal family systems, they'll understand all the different parts that are doing their things. But that's where we can bring this understanding of what is happening inside, give it different categories and names to help us navigate through these rough spots so that we can focus our eyes on Christ and move towards Him in a more deep and rich way, and in owning it too, right? So if I'm in that staff meeting and I'm really struggling to say something, whether I say it in that moment or later, like, you know what, I'm sorry I didn't say something, but really what I was feeling was my voice and presence didn't matter. And I know that's my thing, and I'm really sorry. I'm working through it, but I'd really love your help in this. That's a whole different conversation because I'm not dependent on people coming through for me. I'm dependent on the Holy Spirit coming through. But I can also ask people to help me and to encourage me in my own path towards growth and to also catch me when I fall. So these are all the different ways Jeff and I have used it with different staffs we've been on, and even in our own relationship. These are the ways that we talk to one another.
And Beth, just even what you're saying right there just really kind of reminded me of something you said earlier, just that it kind of, our position in Christ isn't up for grabs. And so being reminded in one sense with those rumble strips that my identity, my worth, my value, who I am in Christ is not up for grabs in this situation where I'm feeling missed or that core longing isn't getting met. I remember reading about an example of a pastor who is explained to others why he rarely spent any time with his staff, where he said, we will have all kinds of time to meet together in heaven, but now we have work to do. We have souls to save and disciples to make. As a two, when I read about this example, or when I've heard similar stories of others in ministry, for me as a two, it stirs up those core fears that are in my heart of being rejected or seen as dispensable or unworthy of relationship. How is, like, say, for those who are listening, for you as a 6 and a 9, how would that kind of interaction, play out in your hearts?
Yeah, and I actually love that you brought that up because because what Jeff and I have said is pastors are preaching through the lens of their own type.
Yeah.
And not because they're not trying to, it's just who they are.
Yeah.
And so you have to remember that. So when someone says something like that, you're thinking from your type like a certain thought perspective. So for you as a 2, it's like, I better, double down my efforts and help the kingdom of God and help all these people.
Yeah.
And and so it sounds noble and good, but here's the thing. If Jesus, though Jesus isn't a type, if he was a type 2, then the type 2 would look at Jesus and go, well, you sure didn't do actually a good job as a 2, because a type 2's thought mentality is, if I were Jesus and I had the abilities that Jesus had, I would have been with the masses 24/7, 365, healing every person, and everyone would have been, saved and healed in the moment. That's what a 2's mentality they think is, but that's not Jesus' example. His example, following the Father, was that he was with the 12 and the 3 and himself more often than he was with the masses. And if we look at the type 2's hard wiring when on this side of heaven, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
A type 2, if they had all of the abilities that Christ had, would have done all the things. And so what I want people to realize is there's a lot of noble things that each of our types could do, but what is God calling us to do?
Yeah.
And part of the 2 in surrendering to Christ is recognizing the limiting factors of being a human.
I was going to say, just as you said that, like, one of the things is which is easier to preach or counsel as opposed to like, what does it mean for me as a 2, but just is that, I'm sitting with another 2, just trying to care for them in one sense, saying, are you seeking to be more Christ-like than Christ? And I was actually kind of joking with a friend, saying, the book needs to be written where the title of the book is that, Jesus napped. you know?
Yes,
You know?
exactly.
You know?
And here's the thing, not only did Jesus nap, he napped while the boat was
Yeah,
sinking,
that's
basically.
right. That's right.
Like
Yeah,
that's the opposite of what a two would
that's
do, right?
right. Yeah,
And now, of course, he's God, he's sovereign, he knows
yeah,
exactly what was
yeah,
happening and all that stuff.
yeah,
But
yeah.
it's really good for us to take at all of our types to take a look at Christ's life
Hmm.
and how was he provocative for our type. So, like a type 8, the Last Supper goes so counter to a type eight's hardwiring because he literally derobed himself, washed people's stinky feet that he knew was going to betray him that night, and then he went through his death to rise again on their behalf and all of our behalfs. And like that goes so counter to what a type 8's need. They feel the need to protect themselves from being challenged and harmed and controlled. And so to see the vulnerability of Christ and the strength of Christ really is a great example for the type 8 to follow. So Christ shows us this for all of our types. So for me as a type 9, Christ entered conflict. He stirred up conflict.
Yeah.
He flipped tables in the temple. Like for a 9, it's like, wait,
Yeah.
you're just like allowing people to notice you and get upset with you. Why would you do that? But he shows me there are things in life that are worth saying and standing up for that are hard. And not everyone is going to like you. And there's going to be turbulence. And that can be okay. Now, I say that tongue in cheek because there's even things like with doing the Enneagram from a Christian perspective. I have a lot of people on the Christian side and then the Enneagram side that may not like how I specifically do it, which is literally the hardest thing for me. I just want everyone happy.
Yeah.
But I feel called by God to stand in the gap and to do it from a Christ-centered, Christ-honoring perspective. And not everyone is going to agree with that. And that is hard. So that's a kind of example for me. I'm sure Jeff has his own.
I was just wondering, Jeff, for you, just as a 6, how that kind of interaction at a staff meeting would work out in your heart.
Oh man. Sometimes Beth and I, we call it walking the wheel,
Yeah.
where we'll take a phrase or a behavior and go through why each type would say that.
Yeah.
So a type 1 might say it because they believe that is the ultimate right thing to do.
Yeah.
But the blind spot for the 1 is that what they often miss out on is people. In order to be right, it comes at the expense of people. Mm-hmm. You guys just talked about why a 2 would do it. A 3 might do it because of image, and because that's what success means. Matter of fact, you find that I'm mindful of a particular campus ministry that our son's a part of where 3s would thrive because you got to report the numbers. How many times you share the gospel? Mm-hmm. How many people are you meeting with for discipleship? And so they're going to, oftentimes he'll tell me they put evangelism and ministry ahead of just being with people and having fun. They can't even be with their friends without this impressing thing of, well, are there other non-believers there? So each type would do this in radically different ways, but usually it's a self-protective mechanism, which can be, number one, kindness. I think, give the leader a break, because they're working out their own heart as well. Yeah. And then I think number 2, to understand your own heart whenever you hear that from your lead pastor and you experience the disappointment or the distance or feeling rejected, well, ask yourself why you feel rejected.
Yeah.
What is it that you wanted from another person that maybe there may or may not be the one to provide that for you?
Yeah.
And so these become opportunities for consideration before God, because he's not anxious about what's happening. He's not disappointed with what's happening. He's fully aware that he has given the leadership of his church to broken people. Mm-hmm. And he's not changed that strategy yet. So he's not anxious about it. So let's use these kinds of opportunities to engage with him rather than trying to fix one another.
Yeah, it's really clear that it's not a man-made endeavor after 2,000 years. Just that God ordained as far as how the church has continued in light of, our sin and brokenness. And it just makes me think in light of that brokenness, just something that my wife and I talk about a lot, just how it's so easy for us, whether it's in marriage or ministry, or with so many different things, for us to kind of take those expectations in our heart and just put those expectations and rest them on someone's shoulders apart from Jesus Christ, and just how a crushing burden that is to kind of put those hopes and longings to be fully fulfilled, as far as the hopes of new heaven and new earth, on to a human being, and just where Christ is inviting us to yoke our heart to Him and Him alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I think just piggybacking on that is, we talk often about Jeremiah 2:13 and how God has said, we have forsaken the spring of living water, and we have turned away from Him, and we have turned to digging a cistern. And then not only is that cistern there, and we have to fill it with stuff, but it's broken. And so if you're trying to fill a cistern, which is kind of like a well, and you have to fill it with water, but it's broken, it's just going to seep into the ground. Like, it doesn't satisfy. And we do that with our spouses, our kids, careers, ministry, etc., thinking if people just come through for me, if I just come through in this way, then I'll be okay. And that's where, when you read our book, you'll see us talking about that, and how we have this core longing that we want satisfied. And that is a God-given thing, but we try to get that from all of these other areas, these cisterns, and they cannot sustain us. Because even like with Jeff, like, Jeff, you need to fulfill this core longing of mine, which mine is to hear that my presence matters. Well, Jeff could come with a water bottle and try to pour as much as he can into that cistern, and he's really trying as a human. But one, he cannot give me as much as I need. And two, the cistern's broken. So even if he were to have a hose, it's still not going to work. Yeah. But right next to me is the spring of living water, which I can drink as much as I need and be fulfilled in the exact way that I need it. And that's where I think if each of us in ministry recognize that we have broken cisterns that we're trying to fill apart from God, and not even knowing it. So this isn't to heap on condemnation and shame. It's more of a wake-up moment. Like, how am I trying to fill myself up apart from Christ? And then recognize that and go, praise be to God that He has shown me this. How can I now turn to the spring of living water? And when and where do I turn away from it and to these cisterns? And that recognition is really a sweetness of the Lord to give us that insight, so that, again, this rumble strip, so that we know when to turn back to the spring and continue to get filled up. And then also, as you know your staff's types and their core longings, and you see them trying to fulfill it apart from Christ, that is a great opportunity for us to then encourage them to move back to Christ and to support them in that endeavor. So how can we all in ministry and as believers come alongside each other and point each of us back to Christ? That's the goal.
It's just so helpful. So appreciate just our conversation today. I'm just wanting to wrap up now, but Jeff and Beth, just so thankful for your time and just how the Lord is using you both. And one of the things that's just so evident is just your love for the Lord and love for people. And so just really appreciate just y'all's work. Just was wondering, what's the best way for people to get connected to your work, and if they want to know more about the Enneagram?
Yeah. So we've got a free assessment on your enneagramcoach.com. That's just to guide people towards their type. It's not the definitive word, but it's all from a Christian perspective. So people can take that, see their percentages, start to learn about the types. And then if they're interested in knowing more about the Enneagram and they're still new at it, Discovering You is a great online course that helps them to understand the Enneagram and all 9 types. And most people are going to find their type by the end of that. If you do the free assessment, they'll actually give you a 50% off coupon code. And then if you're like, I want to go deeper, Exploring You is me doing a 5 coaching series. It's pre-recorded on your type. And I'm literally guiding you in understanding your personality. So I break it down to bite-sized lessons so that you're not overwhelmed, but you can grow. And it's all from a Christ-centered perspective. And then not only that, but we have a new marriage platform so we have the book, the Becoming Us book that you can get. which is a great resource. I mean, anywhere if you're a beginner or if you've used it for a long time. But then we also have a deep dive called Becoming Us, the online course. And we develop 45 courses for all 45 marriage types, couple types. And Jeff and I get very specific with how you fall into the same common pitfalls as a couple, but also how to then align your heart with the truth of the gospel to have hope and renewal together. So those are just some ways. And then, of course, we're on Instagram, and it's a great community to learn a lot about their types in a free way.
Well, thank you guys so much. Really thankful for you both.
Yeah, thank you. This
Michael.
is fun.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've been enjoying the podcast, I'd really appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes or Facebook. If you know someone who might enjoy or be encouraged by the show, feel free to share the podcast with them. Your willingness to share the show is one of the best ways to help it grow. As always, thanks for listening. Until next time.